but I do think that there's something that they have to do if they even want to have a chance.
Okay, go for it.
They got to own it.
Yes.
And I think
they got to do the Domino's pizza campaign. They have to admit
Yeah.
that pizza tastes like cardboard.
Yeah, they do. They made a catastrophic mistake, but everybody loves a comeback story.
This is Open Work, a look inside the watch industry, a podcast from Collective Horology. I'm Gabe Riley, co-founder of Collective.
And I'm Asher Rapkin, co-founder of Collective. Collective Horology is an independent watch retailer based in Southern California. We carry a wide range of independent brands, including the latest brand to join our shop, Karl Suki & Son. I am incredibly excited about this for any number of reasons, not least of which being that we have the incredible opportunity of not only being able to work with watchmakers that are making great product and are developing really beautiful watches, but also people that we genuinely like. And that's been a real theme with the folks that we work with and is absolutely true with Robert, the founder, the modern day founder, I should say, of the Karl Suki brand. Karl Suki is a label that's been around for quite some time and has a lot of
founded in 1822.
There you go. And the heritage goes back, as Gabe pointed out, all the way to 1822. And I encourage folks to look not only at the modern watches that are coming out of the modern interpretation of the brand, but also some of the heritage of the brand, which you'll be able to read about on collectivehorology.com in the coming weeks, as well as on their own website. The watches are absolutely gorgeous, starting with the everyday wear pieces like the Belvedere line and going all the way up to some of the most incredible clocks. In fact, the first clocks that are available in the Collective shop that we've ever seen. So if you have a moment, come by, check them out. And of course, if you're in New York for Watch Time, Karl Suki will be there and exhibiting. And that is an amazing opportunity to go hands-on with the full line and meet the team.
Yep. So everything is on collectivehorology.com. Plus, we just posted a video to YouTube, a look at the Belvedere collection, which is their sports watch collection. We talked about that, I think, on our Geneva Watch Days pod as a highlight of watch we were able to go hands-on with there. Very cool. And we have a bunch of content planned for Karl Suki about the history of the brand, as Asher mentioned. So we're thrilled to have them. And Asher's right. They really are wonderful people. And that makes it even more worthwhile. But today, we're going to talk about a different brand, Asher. We're going to talk about Bremont, and specifically,
have we ever talked about Bremont?
We've never spoken about. Well, no, that's true. We have spoken about Bremont. In fact, this in many ways is a continuation of our recording from Watches and Wonders 2024 when Bremont relaunched. So today we're going to take a look at the business of Bremont, and that's because on September 5th, 2025, under British law and as originally reported in WatchPro, the brand filed their 2024 financial year report, which saw the brand post a whopping £9 million plus loss. In addition to those numbers, the report reveals a great deal about the state of Bremont's business and their strategy going forward. And although it was just filed this month, it's important to note the reporting period actually ends in June 2024. So a lot, of course, could have changed between now and then. But this gives us an incredible amount of transparency, which is self-reported into Bremont's business. And that's rather unusual for the watch industry where, generally, as you've said, with, publicly traded brands that do report publicly, there's a lot of moving pieces and things that can be shuffled around to tell the story they want to tell. And in the case of most independent brands, which are privately held, they're generally not required and they don't report publicly on their finances and on their earnings and things like that. Bremont is unique because under British law, and it really depends on the nature of the business, the size of the business, number of employees, things like that. But Bremont is required to publicly file their results. So this gives us a very unusual and interesting look into the brand. At the same time, the ownership group of Bremont has also been, or has, I think, tried to be kind of transparent about what's going on there as well. So that's not just Davide Serrato, who's the CEO, but also Bill Ackman, who's now the majority shareholder. They've spoken very publicly about what's going on at the brand. So we did a couple of things to prepare for the show today. first is we looked at that report, so that financial year 2024 earnings report from the brand. It's a 56-page document. So there's quite a lot in there in terms of the financial performance of the brand, but a lot of detail into their strategy and how they're sort of addressing what they're, I think, calling a turnaround of the brand. We'll talk about that. I also did a lot of research looking at public statements. So I looked at interviews with Davide Chirato. I looked at public statements that Bill Ackman has made about the business, listened to podcast interviews, read articles, all that sort of stuff. And then I've spoken directly with a number of people connected to Bremont. So these are people who are both currently and formerly connected to the business. That includes employees, retail partners, as well as media, who obviously have access and have reviewed pieces and have their own point of view and have been covering Bremont in one way or another, whether it's the business or the products. So we tried to take a pretty comprehensive look at Bremont, not just in terms of what they're reporting, but everything we can find about the business to dive into what's going on.
Yeah. And before we go any further into that and share all of this and ultimately discuss it, I do want to point out that, as Gabe mentioned, it is deeply unusual to have this level of transparency and such open books. We're certainly not used to that here in the United States. There is no public reporting requirement for privately held businesses. So we're going to do our best to treat this with respect as well, because there are things in here that I think are incredibly challenging. And, we're going to offer some perspective on it. We're going to do some analysis, but I also recognize how it would feel for somebody to look inside of Collective's books, for example, and start discussing that on a podcast. So I want to treat this with the same respect that we would want to have somebody treat us.
Fair enough. Speaking of which, I was going to talk a little bit about why this matters, why even care. And I think the first point there is, Bremont is a beloved brand, and it's a brand that both you and I have ourselves loved and respected for a long time. And
I've been a multiple Bremont watch owner.
There you go. So what's your first Bremont memory?
Oh, geez. Probably hearing about the MB2, which is still my favorite watch that they've ever made. I suspect a lot of people feel that way too. I mean, it was very much the signature. And I just remember seeing that at a retailer in Northern California. And I was in a very tool watch phase, and it just, that thing is built get ready with the beep here, Gabe. That thing is built like a brick shithouse.
No, you can curse on this podcast.
Oh, well, there you go. Yeah. Explicit rating. But it really was. And I remember seeing it in the knurled barrel and the curved lugs and the incredible detente of the click of the internal bezel. It just felt like a proper tool. It really did. And at the time, they weren't that expensive. I think they were around $4,000, and it was just an incredible watch. Remember, this is pre-Tudor in the United States. There was a huge gap for affordable, intense watchmaking. Plus, I remember also they came actually to my workplace to meet with a local watch club. I remember meeting the English brothers, who really embodied the brand. And there was this real feeling of, excitement when they did their annual limited editions. Remember those where they would use the Bletchley Park limited edition, or some of the, so didn't they do one with the Spruce Goose, or am I making that up?
No, they did. Yeah. Yes, and there were, I think on the case back, there was pieces of the Spruce Goose integrated into the case back of the watch.
And this was just, in a watch world that took itself and to a degree always will take itself so seriously. Bremont was willing to really spread its wings and be something unusual. And there were guys out there who were hardcore collectors of those limited editions.
Yeah. My first memory was around the same time. I think it was 2015, and I was picking up a Tudor Pelagos or Pelagos, whatever you want to call it, from a retailer in Northern California, Davidson and Licht in Walnut Creek. And I went in to pick up the watch, and I remember at the time they had, I don't know if they still do, I don't think they do have Bremont.
No, that's been years since then.
But they had a case for Bremont, and I remember I saw they had a few watches in there. I'm sure the MB2 is in there, but the one that caught my eye was the U2, which the MB2 is a pilot's watch and triptych case design and all that sort of stuff. But it was just a watch that really kind of looked the business. And I remember the thing that really stood out to me was the case and the triptych case construction in particular, because that design was to watches what something like a Land Rover is to cars. Mm-hmm. it had a very distinct silhouette, but it's also a silhouette of a watch and a design of a case and construction that just, like I said, it looks the business. Like you look at that thing and you know that it can take a beating, and it's meant to be used and abused. And there was just something overall about the design of the watch, which is a little bit more simple and straightforward compared to the MB2, that just spoke to me.
There was another thing about it, which I thought was pretty awesome, and then we can get into the numbers here, but Bremont really was a brand that cured me of the, rolling your eyes at a Solita or Etta movement, illness, this obsession with if it has that movement in it, it must not be quote unquote worth it. And the reason Bremont broke me of that was I came to the realization that Bremont, above all, was a watch company, but a case manufacturer.
Well, this is something that our friend Zach Pina pointed out to you.
100%.
So you didn't come to that realization on your own.
We came to it together
I don't know.
through debate.
Sure.
Fine. All right, let's give it to Zach. But point being, that's what we really landed on, that this company is a case manufacturing company that makes watches. And you started to realize, both of us pointed out the triptych case.
Yeah.
As a thing that really sold us in on the line. And that really helped me open my eyes subsequently to be able to look at a watch not as the sum of its parts, but really ask myself, well, what am I buying when I'm buying this thing? Because if you want everything to be, in-house, you're going to pay insane amounts of money. And the real question is, what are you leaving behind when you do that? And what you might be leaving behind is some real creativity, like what we see from early
Bremont would never have been able to develop a triptych case, which is just so cool. And still to this day, every time I see a triptych case, no matter how old the watch, I am just so tickled by it. It's just really cool. So like we said, this matters because Bremont is a beloved brand, not just theoretically to some people out there in the ether or folks who collected their limited editions, but to us as well. It's a brand that we admire, we respect, and we want to see succeed. It's also, I think, why this matters. Two other points here is this is a very impressive brand. Take a moment and think for a second about any other watch brand. And I'm using the word brand in particular here. Any other watch brand that was started in the last 25 years that has been able to build as successful of a brand as Bremont.
Yeah.
I mean, this is something that actually a watchmaker pointed out to me, someone who was a watchmaker at Bremont, that more than being an impressive watch company, what Bremont really was and Bremont really is an extremely impressive brand. The number one thing that the English brothers did and did well above all else was build a successful global brand. Now, there have been many watch brands, independent brands, micro brands that have launched in the last 25 years, but none of them, I don't think, have reached kind of the status of Bremont. This is a brand that has like a boutique on Madison Avenue in New York City.
Yeah.
It fits right in. I mean, they built something that was truly impressive, basically a mainstream luxury watch brand. And I can't think of anyone else who's done that as well as Bremont in the last 25 years. And then finally, this is a very highly visible and high stakes turnaround. This is what's going on at Bremont is very much happening in the public eye. They have really put themselves out there in terms of the degree to which they've drawn a line in the sand, made very big changes to the brand and to the business, and also have people out there speaking very publicly about it, whether it's Davide Chirato or Bill Ackman. In fact, Bill Ackman has promised regular updates on the brand Drive to Survive style to kind of fill people in on what's going on behind the scenes. So there is kind of a high visibility and high stakes nature to this that's very unusual.
Yeah.
So we're going to get into what we learned in this earnings report, but just real quickly, I want to do like a very top level timeline of what's gone on at Bremont, because I think the context here is important and it's going to inform what happened in their last financial year. So the brand was founded in 2002 by Nick and Giles English. They introduced their first commercial product, their first watch, in 2007. In 2016, they announced plans to increase in-house watch production and revive watchmaking in the UK, a little bit controversial at the time. And to pay that off in 2021, they opened The Wing, which is their watchmaking and manufacturing facility in Henley-on-Thames in the UK. Fast forward to 2023, Bill Ackman, as we mentioned, took an investment in Bremont. So at the time, he invested about 48 million British pounds in the brand, which valued the brand at about 130 million pounds. Davide Acerato, in later that year, in May of 2023, was named CEO to lead the turnaround. Nick and Giles that year took a step back from the brand. I'm not really clear to what extent they're still involved, although it appears they do maintain a small ownership stake in the brand. In 2024, at Watches and Wonders, the brand relaunched. So they not only relaunched their products, which we'll talk about, but they also literally relaunched everything about the brand. And then in April of 2025, Bill Ackman increased his stake to 63%, becoming the majority shareholder of the brand and non-executive chairman. So he has a role on the board as well. So that gives you a sense of when the brand started and when the major kind of milestones in the business took hold. Now, in terms of the ownership breakdown, this is really interesting. The details of this are all in this 56-page report. So as I mentioned, Bill Ackman, through one vehicle or another, owns 63.2% of the company. So he's the majority shareholder, and he obviously controls the voting rights, and he's on the board of the company. There are, however, other shareholders in the company. So about 37% of the company is owned by a group of about 20 minority shareholders. None of them owns more than 5% of the company or the voting rights, which is interesting. So there is a small group of about 20 people who own those remaining shares. That does include the founders, Nick and Giles. It includes some early investors, some friends and families, some employees and past employees, as well as at least one other board member. So there are other people involved in the business, but the straw that stirs the drink in terms of the money in, as well as who has really the voting rights and the say about what happens, is Bill Ackman, which I think is very, very important and will play into things.
I think it's also important to give a little context on Bill Ackman himself. So for those who are not familiar or have heard the name in passing, Bill Ackman is an investor, probably most famous for being the founder and CEO of Pershing Square Capital, which I believe is an early 2000s a start date, like 2004, 2005. The thing that he's probably most known for there is as being an activist investor. And he's taken a lot of contrarian and bold positions, some of which have really, really, really paid off.
Some of which have blown up spectacularly as well.
But you got to respect the risk to a certain degree. He invested heavily in Herbalife. He invested...
he did not invest in
Herbalife. He shorted Herbalife.
So one of his most famous blow-ups, and look, I have no love for Herbalife and what they do. I would agree in premise with Bill Ackman on this, which is... I won't get into my views on Herbalife and multi-level marketing, but one of his big blow-ups was shorting Herbalife.
Yep.
And that blew up spectacularly. Not that he was wrong, but I believe he got squeezed on that short.
Yep. He's also very famous. He hedged against the COVID-19 market downturn, and that netted Pershing Square billions of dollars. He invested in Hilton. I think he invested in Chipotle.
Chipotle is probably his biggest, most high-profile turnaround story, and one that really put him on the map as an investor. But he's had some other blow-ups like Valiant Pharmaceuticals.
Oh my God, yeah.
But this is a guy who certainly knows more about investing or has forgotten more about investing than we'll ever know.
Yes,
and is a very smart and respected person in that world.
Totally. And I also want to point out, because this is, I think, just a commendable and impressive thing, he's also signed the Giving Pledge, which for those who are unfamiliar is for extraordinarily wealthy people who are basically pledging to donate to philanthropy the majority of their fortunes when they pass. So I think, and he is also a pretty well-known philanthropist as well.
Do you want to talk about his role on the Harvard board? Or should we skip that?
We should probably skip that.
All right, we'll skip that. But I mean, look, suffice it to say, I think the profile of Bill Ackman is like incredibly accomplished, very smart, very rich, but also someone who is an activist. So whether he's sticking his nose in what's going on at Harvard or Chipotle or Herbalife or whatever
Canadian
it is.
Railways, I think he was.
That's
Canadian Pacific Railways.
I can't remember what the railway is in Canada, but that was a successful investment for him. But he's someone who does, for better or worse, stick his nose into the businesses in which he's involved or the causes in which he's involved. And he has a history of getting involved in very high stakes, high risk positions, whether they're shorts or long positions. And so Bremont plays plays right into that. One thing that's really interesting, in fact, speaking of him being aware about this, is he's even quoted acknowledging the risks of Bremont. So in April of this year, when he increased his ownership stake, here's what he said about that, about the risks and the high stakes nature of that investment. In the modern era, building an independent watch company into a major company, let alone one in the UK, has rarely, if ever, occurred. The watch world is littered with many such failed attempts, so it is far from guaranteed that we will succeed in building a profitable and sustainable company, let alone a major independent player. So this fits right in to Bill Ackman's playbook.
Well, what's interesting to me, though, as we now dive into like the structure of the businesses, there's that comment from Bill Ackman about it. But then there's also this one around the perceived opportunity, which I'm going to read and then let's talk about it. Quote, Bremont has a unique brand story and heritage, particularly for a 23-year-old company, with 2 decades of credibility in war zones and air combat missions with the best warfighters and military pilots in the world. Bremont also makes a limited number of watches, around 10,000 per year, compared with more than 1.2 million for Rolex and 70,000 for Patek Philippe, and scarcity drives value in luxury goods. The combination of battlefield credibility, rarity, quality, and a fair price makes Bremont an extremely attractive alternative to the typical Rolex or Patek, which everyone seems to be wearing in my industry, a ubiquity in my view that loses its luster over time. End quote. Okay.
There's a lot to discuss in there.
Yeah.
Now,
in former lives, I used to write marketing for giant corporations, and this reads to me like the kind of stuff I would write when I was trying to make a case for something, where it's basically standing on, it is a stool with very loose legs. If you really break down what he says here as the opportunity is, he believes that scarcity of production is equivalent to brand equity. That doesn't make any
something's
sense.
Desirable simply because there aren't many of them?
Correct.
Sure.
So in other words, he's basically saying, well, because there's fewer watches made by Bremont, and there's some heritage there from the connection to the military, etc., surely we will be as desirable as a Patek or a Rolex, but we're going to remove from that the power of the brand equity of Patek and Rolex, which is, for a guy who has a pretty strong understanding, arguably, of the power of brand and how that operates, is a quizzical statement.
Yeah, I mean, frankly, it strikes me as a bit naive. This strikes me as a quote or a mindset of someone who has a very and extremely high level view of watches and the watch industry, because it's easy to say, oh, well, if these other brands are popular and being worn by people in my industry, surely we can do the same thing over here. The opportunity is clear. And it fails to acknowledge why Rolex and Patek Philippe are as strong as they are and the realities of the watch market in particular, and how just difficult it is to build a successful watch brand at all, let alone one that reaches the level of desirability of those brands. So speaking of how difficult it is,
let's look at the numbers.
Yeah, let's not bury the lead. So as we mentioned, Bremont released their 2024 financial results very recently, and let's take a look at a high level. So revenue for their 2024 financial year. So their financial year 2024 bridges 2023 and 2024. So it runs from July of 2023 to June of 2024. So this was the era when, as we mentioned in the timeline, Davide Chirato had just taken over. This was the era when Ackman had taken his first ownership stake in the brand. So this is the first year of the Bremont turnaround, just to put things in context. In that time period, they did about 22 million pounds, British pounds, in revenue. That translates to just about 30 million US dollars in revenue in that business year. And they had they had a net loss, so after taxes, of 9.7 or 9.8 million pounds. That translates into, in today's currency, that would translate into a $13 million loss. So they're bringing in about 22 million pounds in revenue, and they're losing nearly 10 million pounds.
Basically, they spent 30 million to make 20 million.
They spent 30 million, yeah, and that's tough. Now, I want to say Bremont has acknowledged this. They're in a turnaround phase, but I want to put
Sure.
this into a broader perspective. One thing that WatchPro in their reporting on this did was they took a historic look at Bremont's business performance, both their revenue as well as their profitability over time. And they went back to 2012 in this analysis. And the interesting thing is generally Bremont has grown its revenue over that period of time, but their losses have also grown over that same period of time. We'll put a link to that WatchPro article in the show notes for this. So if you want to look year by year by year and see how Bremont was performing in terms of revenue and profitability, you can check that out. But a couple of highlights. First, Bremont sort of peaked in terms of their revenue in the financial year that ended in June of 2018. So their 2018 financial year, where they did, it looks like about 26 million pounds in revenue. So
gross revenue.
In gross revenue, yeah. That same year, however, they lost, it looks like just over 3 million pounds. In the last few years, so if we look at
which feels like something that you could close a gap on if you were growing that way.
Yeah. In their last few years, though, the losses have really mounted. So in the year previous to 2024, so 1 year before, they did make slightly less revenue. So their profitability was their revenue was just over 20 million pounds. So they did increase their revenue slightly year over year. But that preceding year, they lost nearly 14 million pounds, which in dollars, I don't even want to do the math, but we're in the high teens there. That was their worst year in terms of lack of profitability. The brand has actually had some years, it looks like, that were either neutral or profitable. I'm counting 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 years, but this is going back to 2012. So the story of Bremont historically is a brand that has consistently grown revenue. They had their best year in 2018, but it's a brand that just has put up mounting loss after mounting loss after mounting loss. And again, just so there's transparency on this, we'll put the link to this WatchPro article that has these charts in there.
Yep.
So you can check it out. So look, giving Bremont the benefit of the doubt here, and again, this is a business we all presumably want to see succeed and do well. Clearly, they needed a change in strategy. They needed to do something differently. They couldn't continue to gradually increase revenue, but either continue to lose money or face mounting losses. They did need to make a change of the magnitude, I would argue, that they did by bringing in new investors, changing the leadership of the company, bringing in a new CEO, and doing things differently. I think that's reasonable to say, unless you would disagree with that.
Yeah.
So I want to break down the things that they've actually done differently here. I count about 5 things that Bremont has done differently to address these pure. Let's stay away from the product and all that for a second, but like acknowledging hey, look, this is a business and the business needs to run in a profitable way. Here's what they've done.
Reasonable.
Number 1, leadership overhaul and governance reset. So obviously they've changed leadership and the ownership of the company and how they plan to manage the company. Number 2, which I think we should really chat about here, is brand and product repositioning. They moved away historically from the things that define the brand and have now expressed the brand in a very different way, both in terms of the logo, the word mark, the look and feel, but also the pillars around which the brand is based, which are air, land, and sea.
Yep.
They've made changes to their products. So they've actually massively simplified their product collections. They've organized them around air, land, and sea. And in some ways, they've moved down market just in terms of price point with new collections at a more affordable price. They've made operational improvements to the way they run their business. So they've consolidated their operations into the wing. They've reduced headcount. I guess, unfortunately, they've had to let people go, but they've done things to improve the way they run their business on a day-to-day basis. And they've also been changing their retail and distribution strategy, which they say is more focused now on growing their higher profitability channels like mono-brand boutiques and direct-to-consumer sales. So these are all the things they're doing differently strategically. I'm not so sure all of those things are working. I'm not going to debate whether they should be looking at their retail and distribution strategy, whether they should be improving the operations of their company, whether they needed new leadership. I think we can agree on that. I think the things that are worth discussing here is how are the brand and product repositioning working, and how are the changes to their products working?
Look, all of that is giving a pretty significant benefit of the doubt. And from a strategic position, if you were a consultant called in to talk to Bremont, you'd probably say a lot of those things. Let's go back to Watches and Wonders in 2024. We're walking in the door and we see the Bremont booth, which was a multi-million franc execution, one of the largest booths in the space certainly in the space it was in. And every single person, for the most part, walked by that booth. And every single person had the same reaction, which was, what on earth did they just do?
I'm not sure every single person had that reaction.
People who cared about Bremont,
but a lot of people
fine. People
did.
who had Bremont on their radar.
Yeah.
And you can really boil it down into and now, like, put the strategy aside. Let's look at the execution. You can boil that down into a couple of key, I would argue, missteps. And I don't want to talk about what they've done.
I wouldn't put the strategy aside. I think there were strategic missteps there.
Let me put you this way. I think the strategy of what they're trying to do here, which if you really, really, really zoom out, what are they trying to do? They're trying to turn Bremont into more of a mass market brand.
Yes.
And what are they also? And what do you need to do to make that possible? You need to reduce the cost of production, increase the perceived value, and increase the the demand for that product, so that it costs less to make more and you can sell more.
So what I'm hearing from you is
cynical about it, but that's really.
But what I'm hearing from you there is that you either agree with that or you view that as, like, given the circumstances, that was kind of necessary and that was what
I
they
think it
needed
is
to
a
do.
reasonable strategy.
Okay.
I'm not saying it's the strategy that, like, I would have employed. I think there are other reasonable strategies that you could have employed too, and other paths they could take, which we can talk about.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think that strategically, I don't think that that's, like, unreasonable.
So you're going to pick a bone with how that came to life.
Yeah. Now, I can argue also that if we knew that there was a core collector community that was really into the higher priced, more rare, more limited pieces, maybe Bremont could have become a more profitable company making fewer products at lower volume if they completely reinvented the business there, which they clearly were willing to do. I don't know if they explored that or if that makes sense. My point just being, like, I think there were other paths to be explored.
By the way, on that topic, I totally forgot about this watch, but it actually goes to your point of, like, well, what if they moved more up market and explore that? You remember the Supernova?
Of course.
That was their integrated bracelet sports watch offering. I totally forgot about that watch. And
that watch was the right watch executed poorly.
Yeah, but it's interesting. I was,
from a design standpoint,
I was thinking intellectually, like, okay, well, what if you didn't take the approach? And I think I agree with you in broad strokes, which was, like, faced with the circumstances the leadership at Bremont is faced with, did it make sense to say, we're going to try to popularize this brand and make it more commercial and produce, more, like, I think generally, and, like, lower price point and all that sort of stuff. I think I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that, because I did the exercise of, like, well, what if they tried to move, like, upscale?
Yeah, but again,
what if they became
flaw
a
was
smaller,
in the execution?
What if? But
strategically, they could have done that.
I think the Supernova, we can bicker about, like, the details and the design of that watch and all that sort of stuff. But essentially, what I heard from the retailer I spoke to on that was it did not perform well commercially. It was essentially a dud, at least from the perspective of that retailer, and it was a failed attempt to move up market.
But to that, keeping all of that aside.
So they tried it. And they had that cool watch, the Viper. You remember that one?
The Viper was a genuine.
Yeah, that was awesome.
But anyway, putting that aside, going back to Watches and Wonders, there were two fundamental issues with that reveal, if you will. The first was the brand, the Bremont brand, and the way that it is articulated, the way that it appears visually, what it stands for, was literally just bagged up in a black trash bag and thrown out the back door. And the thing that really blows my mind about that is that ultimately, and this is what we were talking about earlier, what was it that attracted us as enthusiasts? Now, I'm not talking mass market, but as enthusiasts to this brand, it was the things that made them unique. And that was partially the Britishness, if you will, of the brand, the power of the founders speaking about their passion for aviation, the quality of the triptych case and the recognizable nature of it. And those things really came together to make something that felt distinct. there was an executive decision there to say, we don't want to keep any of that. And I'm not saying they didn't have a rationale for it, but they clearly made that decision.
This is what puzzles me. Because you're right. Those are, if you asked yourself in the original Bremont brand, what were the pillars of that brand? What fundamentally defined it? It's those things, it's those ingredients you laid out. And presumably, if you're going to pay, and again, I can't remember what the figure was, but Bill Ackman put 48 million pounds into the business. It valued the business at over 100 million pounds. If you're going to spend that much money for something, presumably you think there's value there.
Presumably.
And as we pointed out, like the product was good, but what really defined Bremont and what really created the value for Bremont was the brand. It was the Britishness. It was the English brothers and their story. It was the triptych case. It was aviation.
Yes.
Like those are the things that defined Bremont, and that was the value. So it's puzzling to me that you'd then turn around and throw all of it out.
And not only do that, but replace it with first a visual identity that is frankly terrible. I mean, and I say this as somebody, I mean, look,
in my
opinion, I think it is not very good. And the reason why I don't think it's very good is that there's nothing about it that feels distinct or unique or
it's generic.
Exactly. And ultimately, you want that brand to represent, you want the visual articulation of the brand to represent some core element of what makes you, what your unique selling proposition is. The compass rose is so generic, it could apply to any number of product categories, et cetera. So
I saw a guy this weekend. I was at a brewery. And this guy walks in with a compass rose tattooed.
Oh, is he a Bremont fan?
On his calf. And I was just like, I immediately, it's because of this, like I just was like, oh, there's the Bremont logo. Now, of course, this guy probably has no idea what Bremont is, and it has nothing to do with that. But yeah, it's rather generic.
100%. So you have that visual identity issue. And then you had the watches that they chose to relaunch the brand with, which, by the way, this is not a unique problem to them. I would argue AP kind of like, created a huge problem for themselves by the watches they chose to launch 1159 with. So this is not even though the 1159 line has evolved into something far more interesting and more beautiful than what was originally launched. And I would argue too that Bremont, the new incarnation of Bremont, has released better watches than what they showcased in the Terra Nova line last year. But that double whammy of what felt like watches that weren't all that creatively impressive, that felt derivative, and didn't even borrow from the creative equity that they already had in the brand, along with the destruction and the abandonment of their original brand identity, really was just a complete head scratcher. And it created, unfortunately, a very aggressive and angry backlash in the collector community.
Can I give one bone
Please.
to the Terra Nova collection? Yeah. I hadn't considered this at all. I generally share your opinion about the brand, both subjectively but also objectively. I'm just like, what this communicates is very generic.
Yeah.
And that's intentional. I mean, they've said they want to move out of just aviation and have a broader appeal. So fine. But one thing I didn't realize about the Terra Nova collection, this came up, Davide Chirato was on a podcast recently, The Real Time Show, with our friends Rob Nuds and Alon Ben Joseph at Geneva Watch Days, actually. And they were talking about the Terra Nova to some extent. And one of the things they pointed out that I did not realize was part of the Terra Nova's design relies obviously heavily on, it's a cushion-cased watch. Mm-hmm. And what they're saying is, cushion cases are becoming synonymous with British watchmaking, and the cushion case was a choice to nod to Bremont's, not just to try to do something differently, but to nod to Bremont's Britishness. Now, I don't know if that's being post-rationalized or whether that matters or not, but that was something I had never considered in terms of why on earth did they pick a cushion-cased watch to put forward as kind of their field watch and their core offering. So I just want to give some benefit of the doubt.
Yeah, I hear teak floats when you float away from the Titanic too. Like, I mean, sure, man.
Yeah, I think, okay. So I'm look, I want to try to represent the other perspective as much as we can. Here's the problem with that, though. When you looked at a triptych case, you know immediately, this is different, this is cool, this is unusual, this looks badass. When you look at a Terra Nova, you don't know what to think, and if you need someone to explain that to you on a podcast,
yeah, well, that's
it's over before.
This is why I roll my eyes at that. Gabe, do you sell watches for a living?
Not really.
Oh, okay. Well, I do.
You do.
So I can tell you, talking to clients on a daily basis, that if the only thing that I've got in my arsenal to really demonstrate what makes something unique is that, a cushion case feels kind of British, even though the watch is not made in England, not anymore. At least that is what we are hearing.
It's assembled in England.
Are we sure that that's true for every watch?
I don't know.
Yeah, so I don't know either, but
the components are not English as far as I know.
Sure.
Let's put it that way.
And many of the components weren't English anyway to begin with.
Yeah.
But my point is, like, if that's the only thing that you've got to sell that watch, that is not going to close a sale. And I think so, like, sure, you can post rationalize that however you want, but I don't see that. And I would also say, if you're so let's assume that was true for a moment. Okay, so let's assume that, like, Davide Torado's, like, vision was to be that nuanced. Then why did they trash the rest of the brand that was so fundamentally, English to begin with? Like, why would you do that if that was the core design element that you want people to know about? That's why I kind of, like, roll my eyes and feel like it's, a little bit of, like,
fair enough. I'm playing devil's advocate here.
Totally. And by the way, the reason that I'm so frustrated by it is because of how much I loved that brand. And I look at it and I just think, and maybe this goes back to the Ackman quote of, like, what he sees as the quote opportunity. The watch industry is a very fickle and unusual business, and you can't approach it the same way when you have an established brand. And what I cannot wrap my head around is, if Bill Ackman thought that there was tremendous opportunity to create whatever brand he thought he was going to create, why he needed Bremont to do it.
Right. If you're going to discard all of those things that made Bremont, why bother the brand? Why not just start with a blank slate?
Yeah, why buy all the baggage that comes with the brand financially or the rest of it? Just, like, take your 40 some odd $1 million, 50 million, 60 million, and just go make a new brand.
Yeah. And there are plenty of examples of that. One brand I think that's an interesting counter to Bremont in some ways is Norcane, which is kind of this, luxury watch brand sort of made from scratch.
Dude, try Shinola.
It's a new, but Shinola has
Shinola is a completely made up heritage and a completely made up story designed to sell mass market watches. And that in and of itself, it was.
But sure, Shinola trades on a brand name that does exist and has history in the United States. And there's part of the reason why Shinola.
Fair. That part, sure. But essentially it is an invented brand.
Yeah.
But yes,
it's sort of.
It has some, what it brought with it was awareness. Like that, like, I'm sure
you don't know shit from Shinola, man.
Exactly, right. But I think there's awareness in the general ethos of Shinola as an American brand. But if you ask somebody what that was, probably a handful of people would give the quote you just gave. Another handful of people would say shoe polish, and then the rest would just be like, I don't know, it sounds American, and that's essentially what they traded off of.
Yeah.
Versus Bremont, which most people in the watch community didn't know about, but the people who did really cared about it.
And here's the problem. I think it, like you and I have said, it's reasonable for Bremont to say, hey, look, people, you've seen the numbers. We have to run as a business. Clearly, we need to change the way this company runs and who it's for and the products we make and all that. That's clear. We can't continue to be the niche player. We can't continue to be the brand that's for a small group of enthusiasts who really love us and are willing to pony up and pay up a premium for our product. We need to be more mainstream. We can't worry about those people anymore. That's a trade-off we have to be willing to make. And you could say, all right, well, that sounds reasonable. That's your prerogative to say that. A retailer pointed out a really good point to me about the importance of the enthusiast community to Bremont, and the mistake that Bremont made walking from their core brand identity and their core customer, which is to say they ended up alienating a lot of people who loved the brand. They ended up alienating a lot of enthusiasts. And you could say, well, okay, that's a trade-off they should have been willing to make. The point this retailer made is, let's take the case of a customer who's never heard of Bremont before, who sees a Terra Nova or something like, oh, that's just a cool watch. I want to learn about it.
Mm-hmm.
This retailer is saying, look, before any customer comes into the store, whether they're a hardcore watch collector or even just a more casual buyer, they've all done their research before they walk through the doors of the store. They go online, they read reviews, they may Google something and see a post on Reddit about it or something in the forums. They may watch a YouTube video. And guess where all of the content about Bremont and Bremont watches comes from? It comes from the enthusiast community. It comes from YouTube reviewers. It comes from people who are active in these communities on the forums and Reddit and so on and so forth. And the sentiment now is so poor around Bremont. These people are so angry at the choices that you've just described that before someone who's new to the brand can even get going, any amount of research they do, they are flooded with negative sentiment. Yeah. And so what this retailer was saying was like, I have a really hard time with Bremont because the people who are the more casual customer they're going after, they do some basic research and everything they hear is not so great. And that creates that creates a ton of inertia to try to overcome in the store and close someone on.
You know who did a good I'm listening to you say this. You know who did an amazing job, and granted this was in, I think it was the 80s, of really creating a brand that did not destroy the heritage of the original brand, but ultimately opened up the ceiling and just grew to a monumental scale?
The World Wrestling Federation?
How'd you know? No, Tag Heuer. Because and even Tag Heuer's modern strategy still speaks to enthusiasts. There are still those limited releases that are Heuer branded chronographs that are heritage oriented, that use in-house movements, etc., that speak to people who really were into the Heuer, the era of high end and, so to speak, beautiful Heuer chronographs. But and those people are not upset that Tag Heuer is a mainstream commoditized brand.
But I think Tag Heuer stumbled into that because they began doing those Heuer vintage reissues and they got a lot of good feedback from the community. Yeah. And again, to play devil's advocate, one thing that both Davide Chirato has said and Bill Ackman has said is, we want feedback. Please tell us. We will make changes. And the example you give with Tag Heuer is an example of a brand trying something and it worked. It generated a lot. I remember the Octavia Cup for Tag Heuer. Yeah. Like, who didn't love that? That was so fun. But they sort of stumbled into that. And I think you have to give them credit for saying, we may have stumbled into this, but this is working. Fan service is important. Having a committed enthusiast audience who's out there and desires our products and speaks highly of them is good for anyone else who's even casually interested in a Tag Heuer. So there's hope for Bremont. Can I talk about one thing they did well?
I want to hear about one thing they did well, but I do think that there's something that they have to do if they even want to have a chance.
Okay, go for it.
They got to own it.
Yes.
And I think
they got to do the Domino's pizza campaign. They have to admit that pizza tastes like cardboard.
Yeah, they do. They made a catastrophic mistake. But everybody loves a comeback story. And
that is true.
I think the first thing they got to do is swallow their pride and admit that the brand is trash and the first watches were a mistake. And if they and they don't have to do that in those words, of course, but they also have to do it in a non-corporate way. And I don't know if that's, Davide facing the camera and saying, here was my logic and here's what I thought. After a year, it's clear this didn't work. Part of what I value myself on is risk taking. And I took a risk and it failed. So here's what I'm going to do differently.
So one thing they did do differently was they followed up. And by the way, the financial results we're discussing go through, as I said, June of 2024. That's over a year ago. So we don't know what's happened in the last year plus. But we do know what's happened in terms of the business and the product in the last year. At Watches and Wonders 2025, they were back. The logo didn't change. They still have the same rebrand and the same
giant booth,
all that stuff. But they did reboot. So previously, obviously, they introduced they retooled their C collection and the Supermarine. They introduced the Terra Nova Field collection. And then this year, they brought their attention back to aviation, what they called their Altitude collection. And the core of this collection is what they call the MB Meteor. Mm-hmm. So this is basically the successor to the Martin Baker collection, the MB2, the MB3. So now they have the MB Meteor collection. They've got a time-only version. They've got chronographs. They have a simple version that kind of reminds me of the old Solo, which was a watch, the Bremont Solo that you loved. They now just released a beautiful version of this watch at Watches and Wonders in titanium called the MB Meteor with an actual, a Meteor-inspired dial.
So I actually went into this, by the way, because I was like, why would you name that watch the MB Meteor?
Yeah. What is the,
Here's
what's
why.
the origin of that?
Because the Gloucester Meteor was the first British fighter jet. It was literally the first jet plane used in World War II by any ally. So if you roll it back and you're like, oh, this is the MB Meteor, that makes sense. But of course, it's weird. And you're like, oh, is this some sort of like weird malaprop or something where it's like, oh, it's the MB Meteor meteorite. You're like, the what now? So a little funky there. But again, and this is why I continue to like say, pump the brakes and rethink this. If you don't want the Britishness, why are you naming a watch after a British plane?
Well, I think
alternatively, maybe you should name the watch after a British plane and go back to that.
Good question. I don't know the answer to that, but what I can tell you is it's a good product. And this is something I've heard universally from everyone I've spoken to about it. So, like I said, it's a successor to the MB2. It's got a triptych case, which is cool. It's a more wearable watch. I think one of the main criticisms about the triptych case and the MB2 and U2 and some of those watches were that they're a bit large, a bit unwieldy. This is a much more ergonomic case. It also comes optionally with a bracelet that's really a nice bracelet.
The bracelet is very attractive. I'll give you that for sure.
So this is a watch that wears, has a lot of the technology and wears much more reasonably, is a nice design refinement, I think, of the MB2. And what I've heard from everyone I spoke to, so media who have gone hands-on with this, retailers who have this watch, this is an excellent product. And I just sort of wonder, well, in fact, one of the retailers told me, two different people told me something interesting. One retailer told me, and this is a retailer who has dozens of brands in their store, major retailer. Mm-hmm. If I could have any watch in the shop, it would be the MB Meteor. Like, that's how much he likes this watch and thinks it's an excellent product. And I had a watch journalist tell me the same thing. Man, if I could have not just any Bremont watch, but if I could add a new watch to my collection right now, it would be an MB Meteor. This is high praise for this product. So I think they did a good job with this product. However, I would argue they got the sequence wrong. They should have relaunched with this product.
Well, that's the 1159 thing.
Exactly. Yeah. They should have relaunched the Bremont brand. And you could say, all right, fine, you're going to redo your branding and your logo and your color palette and all this stuff. But if they came first with this watch and said, look, aviation has always been important. This is what the brand was built on. This is the direction we're taking our product in terms of how we're evolving it and refining it and making it more so with the customer in mind and the wearability of it. Great. The problem is, however, that same retailer who told me, if I could have any watch in my shop, it would be this, has told me they have yet to sell one because of the negative will surrounding the brand. And he's like, look, this isn't a cheap watch. I think they're like $5,700 US dollars. So they're not cheap watches, but I think for what you're getting, the price is reasonable. But his point was like, there's now so much baggage around the brand that it's hard to even get someone interested in a good product for all the reasons that we discussed. And that's a real shame. So I think part of the challenge here is a sequencing challenge. I almost wonder if they had relaunched the brand with this watch, if things might have gone a bit differently, at least from the perspective of sentiment.
Maybe, but this still comes back to my earlier point, which is ultimately, the more they try to act like the decisions they made are justifiable, the more apathy they will get from the community that defines the tone of what people think about the brand.
So one more point on this, and then I want to ask you what you would do differently, because I have an idea about what I would do.
Oh, you mean other than just sit here and throw darts? I mean,
look, we shouldn't just sit here and throw darts. Let's have a constructive idea. But another thing that the retailer told me, which I think is interesting, is if you look at Bremont's financial results for the last 2 years, as I mentioned, they're up slightly in their financial year 2024 versus 2023. And what this dealer told me is that's largely based on sell-in to the dealers. Now, you can imagine in 2024, Bremont introduces this entirely new Terra Nova collection, right? And they have new Supermarines as well. So they have a lot of new product. And by the way, the speed of one thing we should give Bremont credit for, whether we agree with what the result was or the output was or not, is like the speed at which they did this. It's really impressive. To rebrand a business as quickly as they did and reposition it as quickly as they did, and to revamp their products as quickly as they did and prolifically as they did. If you look at the Terra Nova collection that they launched with in 2024, that was a lot of watches.
Yeah.
They did the same thing with the Supermarine collection that year. That was a lot of watches. That is extremely impressive. So what the retailer was saying was like, we bought a lot of Bremont because they had a lot of product to sell into us that year. And what I'm hearing is they're having challenges now selling it through to customers. So you have to wonder, in financial year 2024, they're doing nearly 22 million pounds of business, largely on the back of wholesale and selling into their retailers. Can they lap that number in their next financial year? Maybe they will, but that much new product sold in 1 year to dealers sets the bar very high. So I think the proof will be in the pudding in terms of financial performance if they're able to continue that sell-in, because of course, dealers are only going to continue to buy watches that they can sell.
So you asked me, agreed. You asked me like what I would do differently. What I would have done differently is to invert their strategy. And what I mean by that is, look, we know from anecdotal feedback, I guess we don't know, but like we've heard from anecdotal feedback that there was a rabid fan base for Bremont. And we know that just from our own experience of it too. I think that it would have been a better idea to start at the top and work their way down instead of what they're trying to do here. There is no halo product. And even if there had been, even if this MB Meteor had come out as a halo product, I don't know that it's doing them any service. I mean, now I think we're looking at it in hindsight now. We're like, well, this is good because it's way better than Terra Nova. And arguably it's an incremental, growth on the Martin Baker 2, the MB2. But it's still like, they're still going back to the well of what they walked away from in order to find something good. So my argument,
I think it's a significantly refined product compared to the MB2.
Refined, sure, but it is 100% derived from the MB2. Yeah. So my point is,
a bad thing?
No. What I'm saying is they marched away aggressively from this design language last year, and then now they're coming back to it, which is what they probably should have done initially and just continued to refine it, but they didn't. So my argument would have been what they should have done is not spent all this money on the marketing and the rest, but focused on the higher end of their watchmaking. They were on to something in their partnership with Horage. They were on to something in their limited editions. They were on to something that hooked people. And I think if they had focused not on trying to sell 20,000 or 30,000 or however many watches they're trying to sell, they focused on trying to sell like 2,000, 3,000 at a $20,000, $30,000 or $40,000 price point. Would they have gotten pushback? Absolutely. But if those were still on brand, they would have been able to serve that core customer who has been paying for Bremonts for, over a decade, and then started to work their way down incrementally, building off that equity. Now, would that have turned them into Tag Heuer or Hamilton or Longines and made them into the gigantic mass market brand that Ackman seems to think he's going to have? Probably not. But I think there's two separate questions, which is what would have been the right choice for Bremont, which I think would have been that. And then what would be the right way to build a mass market brand, which I think we both agree is to just start your own brand.
I'll give you my take.
Please.
So congratulations, Gabe. You've just been made the CEO of Bremont. Now you got to do this all over again.
Cheerio and so forth.
Cheerio. Okay. So first of all, I would accept the basic premise here of like, we need to commercialize this brand. We need to do things fundamentally differently. We need to broaden its appeal, all that sort of stuff. Mm-hmm. So I'm not changing that strategy. That's the direction I'm going.
You don't like to rock the boat when you're the CEO, do you?
No. Yeah. And, if the research or whatever the data shows, like, look, the Britishness is limiting, the aviation is limiting, maybe the story of the brand, its founding and Nick and Giles and their passion for aviation and all the cool things they did, like the cannonball run across the U.S. in a vintage Jaguar. That if cool. No one really cares about that and it's too niche, like, okay, I accept that. But there's something about the brand I would have held on to and I would have carried and I would have built the entire brand around. Bremont had this line, and I think it applied to the Martin Baker collection, but they had this line, this like tagline that was so freaking cool. And it was tested beyond endurance. That is what I would have built this entire brand and business around. This idea of tested beyond endurance. So we would have kept this Martin Baker collection. Maybe, we would have done the MB Meteor, and that would have been great. But tested beyond endurance would be the organizing idea and the identity of this brand. We make the most rugged, hardcore, over-engineered, badass watches. That is an idea, one, that can be universally and broadly appealing. It's not so niche. If they're saying aviation is too niche or Britishness is too niche or whatever, this is not too niche.
Yep.
Right? This is an idea people can get around. Number two, it becomes this organizing philosophy for product, right? What does a tested beyond endurance dress watch look like? Is there someone who thinks dress watches, I really want to add a dress watch to my collection, but dress watches are too fussy and delicate. Well, okay, does Bremont do the tested beyond endurance dress watch?
You know what's cool about that? Remember they had that partnership with Kingsman?
Oh yeah.
Like that, that checks, that would check out.
Exactly.
That would really check out.
You could do it for the dive watches. You could do it for field watches, but you would have to answer. And I don't know that like the Supermarine collection as it is now really does. I don't know that the Terra Nova collection does, but every watch would have to answer this question. Okay, well, how is it tested beyond endurance? And it wouldn't need much. It doesn't mean everything has to have a triptych case, right? Maybe there's something else about the design or the construction or the engineering of the watch that means it's tested beyond. That's what I would do. Now, I wouldn't change the branding. Look, the branding, the visual identity of Bremont, its heritage and its rooting in aviation, that's where I think so much of the value of the brand was. I wouldn't change the look and feel. I would continue aviation as the beating heart and the focus of the brand. That's what gives them credibility in this idea of tested beyond endurance. To your point, those squadron watches, like how cool would it be to wear a dress watch from a company that makes watches for squadrons and for the military? Like that just gives you a level of confidence. So that's what I would do. The brand, the visual identity, the logo, the focus on aviation, all that stuff stays. The organizing idea around product becomes tested beyond endurance, and we relaunch the brand with the MB Meteor at Watches and Wonders 2024. So that's what I would do. Now, of course, talk is cheap and hindsight is 2020, but I think the point here is there's still very much hope for Bremont. This is a brand. We're saying this because we want to succeed. And fundamentally, what happens next rests on the shoulder of Bill Ackman. So I want to end with a quote from the annual report here, because this tells us what the fate of Bremont is and where they go next. So in this 56-page report, they say the following: the forecasts here assume the continued support of shareholders to fund the group for the foreseeable future. It also says the directors have received confirmation from shareholders that they will continue to support the group for a period of at least 12 months from the date of approval of these financial statements. What this is telling us is, as goes Bill Ackman, so goes this brand. This is a brand, this is a business that is fundamentally reliable on its shareholders. It's not making money. It's losing money, at least as of this most recently published financial report. And it is reliant, and this is detailed in this financial report, it is reliant on the equity from shareholders to finance the business. So I'm hopeful. Well, first of all, I'm grateful to Bill Ackman for investing so much in this brand and pouring treasure into this brand. I also appreciate that he said this is an open book and he wants feedback. And I'm grateful to Davide Chirato and everyone at Bremont for fighting this fight and doing everything they can to keep a great brand alive and growing. So we'll see where this goes, but it's fundamentally, at the end of the day, going to be up to Bill Ackman, because as the brand has said themselves, they cannot survive or make it without him, without his commitment to continuing this business. So let's see where he takes it.
Let's see where he takes it. And I think we both agree we don't want to see it go away.
Absolutely not. I still have saved searches for Bremont watches that I follow up on all the time. I'm waiting to find that perfect U2. You know, it was a great Bremont U2. We sold one recently. Was the Timeless Luxury Edition. It was It was a no date U2. So typically the U2 would have the day and date on it. It was no date, and it had these beautiful, I think they're blued sword hands. A really cool watch.
Pour one out for Timeless. They made some really good limiteds back in the day.
They're not around anymore?
They got bought by Watches of Switzerland, I think.
Yeah. So add that to your watch recon search for Bremont, the Timeless Luxury Edition U2. Very cool watch. All right. Well, let's leave it there. What do you say?
Sounds good.
Well, thanks for listening. This, of course, is Open Work. It's a production of Collective Horology. You can find us online at collectivehorology.com. And please get in touch with your questions, your suggestions, and your feedback. And to do that, you can email podcast@collectivehorology.com.